Fernando, do you see anybody else on the panelist or attendee list that might need to be promoted or test their audiovisual?
My colleague Katie, she's on the West Coast, so I'll text her.
I'm right here.
Oh, there she is. I didn't
Yep.
see you.
No
Beautiful.
worries.
Poor thing.
It's early, but could be earlier.
Hey, I didn't sleep last night either, so
No,
who cares,
nobody
right?
did. Yeah, exactly. We're in the same boat.
Adila, can we promote Nicanor to a panelist? As well as Victor Show. And Nick, if you can hear us, we test your audio and visual.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you
Hello?
loud and clear.
Yeah, you're breaking up a bit. It might be my connection here. We are actually getting quite a bit of the storm effect coming in already. So I hope that we can keep up the connection here.
Yeah, stay safe down there. And if you have to
Thank
jump
you.
off, absolutely no worries, Nick. Victor, can you hear us okay? We see that your microphone is unmuted, but we can't hear you, Victor.
I think he needs to connect to audio, maybe.
Looks like Victor has another profile under attendees now. We may try that one, Fadila.
And I see that we also have Vanessa joining.
Yes, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Hi, Vanessa. Yeah, we can hear
Hello.
you okay.
Good.
Thank you.
Good morning, Vanessa.
Thanks for joining.
Good morning, everyone. Thank
Morning.
you. Thanks for having me. I'm excited about this discussion.
We're all excited.
Good.
Victor, can you hear us now? Let's try and
Yeah,
test.
could you guys hear me?
Yeah, sounds good.
All right, sorry about that. I actually was joined on my web browser because my app was giving trouble. Then my app popped up, so I guess it caused something weird that I was signed in twice as both a visitor and as a panelist.
We can hear you now. And like I mentioned to Nick, I know you guys are starting to get the outer bands of that hurricane. So safety first, take care. And if you have to jump off, we totally understand.
All right, thanks, because I do have a lot of rain this morning, so my connection might not be the best.
All right, we're gonna start in about 5 minutes. I see Leopoldo on there. Polo, you wanna try your audio?
Yeah, hi, good morning, everyone.
Buen dia, Polo. You got the mangroves in the background. Beautiful.
Gracias.
Hi, Seb, can you hear me?
Yeah, sounds good, Nick.
Just letting you know that my colleagues from Fisheries Department, namely Lyndon, has been pulled into evacuation roles here in this part of the country, so he's not going to be able to join us.
Thanks, Nick. Yeah. We'll be thinking about you all. Stay safe.
Y tenemos también a Laura López de Cuba, que ya logró conectarse, aunque me dice que su conexión está un poco inestable. Laura, ¿podrías hacer una prueba de voz, por favor? Bienvenida.
Gracias a ti, Lalo. Buenos días a todos.
Muy bien, te escuchamos fuerte y claro, y también se ve bien la imagen. Gracias.
Ok, menos mal.
y estamos pensando en todos los colegas que están afectados ahora por ETA. Esperamos que todo vaya bien.
Fadila, just to check, we're going to have kind of a tiled version once we officially start, right? Or at least the
Yes,
speaker
that's
version.
possible. If we want, we can do spotlight view for the beginning for when you do intros, and then I can switch to the gallery.
Okay, perfecto. And I see we're live on YouTube. Anybody that wants to share with the World Wide Web out there, we are live on YouTube now.
I'm sharing it now on social media.
Warren, we had several folks from South Africa join yesterday. We figured that was your doing.
Yeah, it was. It was mostly students and fellow researchers.
Well, thank you for sharing.
Yeah, it's a pleasure.
Just for you to know, we had over 100 people joining the session yesterday, so it was a great turnout.
Yeah, that's brilliant. It's good to hear.
I just wanted to ensure, did someone call me? Krista?
No.
Oh, just checking, because I was away from the computer. I thought I heard Smith.
You're all safe for now, Prescott.
Seth and Lala, do we have all the panelists that you're expecting?
Yes, ma'am. Looks good.
Okay. Should we start in 30 seconds?
Yes, please, Fadila. Okay. Thank you.
Okay, hello, good morning. Welcome to everyone. And welcome to the third day of GCFI 73. We're on our second day of our special session on recreational fisheries, co-hosted with the Environmental Defense Fund. And today we are going to be discussing the needs and opportunities for greater regional collaboration for recreational fisheries management in the Gulf of Mexico and the Caribbean. So to start things off today, I'm just going to introduce our moderators for today. We have Eduardo Bonet and Sep Hawkebo, and they're going to take it away.
Thank you, Fadila, and welcome back, everybody. Thanks for joining us again today. We had some great presentations yesterday, as well as a great keynote. We hope you were all able to catch those. If you weren't able, or if you want to watch some of those again, they will be made available on the GCFI YouTube channel. So we'll send out an email to everybody once those are shared. Yesterday, we heard about a lot of important issues regarding recreational fisheries across the region. We heard about the importance of measuring and understanding economic benefits, but also economic leakage. We heard about scientific studies that help inform decisions around managing the fishery, but also managing development. We heard about how fishing guides are important influencers to their clients, but also with local and national decision makers. And like I tell my little girls, as Spider-Man once said, with great influence also comes great responsibility. And perhaps most importantly, yesterday we heard from many of the presenters the importance of working together. We may disagree on some issues. In fact, we're going to disagree on a lot of issues, but we're also need to continue finding ways to succeed around our common goals. I think that was a very common theme throughout everybody's presentation yesterday. Here at the beginning of this conference, or at least this special session, I also want to be mindful that many of us in the region are watching the US elections. We also know that our friends in Belize have an election taking place next week. So we, Lalo and I, and the rest of EDF want everybody to know that regardless of the outcomes of these elections throughout the region, that we are dedicated to these issues around conservation, and we ain't going anywhere anytime soon. Also, before we start our panel today, I think it's really important to recognize that COVID-19 has disrupted lives and devastated livelihoods around the world, including the Gulf and Caribbean region. We've seen businesses upended, we've seen research halted, we've seen food lines to feed the hungry, we've seen jobs lost, markets lost, but we must continue to work together to bring light to these issues and the solutions, and bring solutions to the table to maintain resiliency during these times. The Gulf and Caribbean are made up of some of the most resilient people on Earth, and one day, hopefully soon, we will begin the post-COVID process of building back better. I heard Katie yesterday reference to post-COVID, and that's, I think, a phrase that a lot of people look forward to. And of course, as Lalo mentioned yesterday, one of our goals in this session is to create a greater sense of community across borders so that we can share lessons learned, best practices to help tackle important issues as a community. And this includes COVID, as well as threats from climate change and any other threats to our fisheries and livelihoods. The Gulf and Caribbean are already incredibly resilient, as I mentioned, and events like the GCFI conference, I think, are critical to growing our relations as neighbors and growing our resilience as a community. Now on to some housekeeping details. I hope everybody has a good cup of coffee, or maybe a couple cortaditos ready, so we can keep the conversation rolling this morning. I want to remind everybody we have an English channel and a Spanish channel with translators providing real-time translation. For anybody that wasn't able to use that yesterday, at the bottom of your screen, the Zoom panel, there's a little globe. You can select English or Spanish channel on there. We encourage everybody to stay engaged in the chat. For this session, only the panelists will have microphone capabilities, but we will have time for questions from the audience through the chat box in about the last 30 minutes of this panel. And now, just like yesterday, we had a quick poll to see where folks are from all around the world. Thought we'd lighten it up a little bit today and ask everybody to type into the chat box. We all know everybody has a crazy friend or family member that's an extremely avid angler. They'll skip work or school or both to go fishing whenever they can. So it'd be great for folks to type in either a name or for me, it's my crazy uncle, but my 6-year-old daughter is right behind him in terms of being an avid angler. So it'd be great to see who folks think their most avid family member or friend angler is. Nobody? Or maybe the chat's disabled? There we go. Krista, Sonia's got the great uncle. It's always the uncles, right? Yeah, Aaron's a good one, Krista. He's read a lot of his papers, never met him. Scott, you're probably crazier fisherman than your grandpa, but you had to learn it somewhere, right? Yeah, your 5-year-old. I like that, Warren. All right. I've heard of Captain Marcos Henke. Graciela. His name precedes him. All right, sounds good. Will got banned from Scott's boat, yeah. For those of you who don't know, Will Heyman's been part of GCFI for a long time, and he is, I think he's still allowed on most boats in the Gulf. All right, well, today we're going to have a live Q&A session. I'll turn it over to Lalo to discuss that a little bit more in detail. Thanks, everybody.
Muchas gracias, Sep, y a todos por unirse. Me dijeron que ayer hablaba muy rápido, así que hoy voy a hablar un poco más lento. Bienvenidos nuevamente a los que se unen a través de Zoom, a los que se unen a través de YouTube. Muchas gracias. Nos alegra saber que tenemos gente conectándose de todas partes del mundo, incluyendo Sudáfrica y, bueno, otros lugares. Ayer tuvimos a más de 100 asistentes y vemos ahora que tenemos al menos 60 asistentes el día de hoy. Entonces, bueno, muchas gracias por dedicarnos su tiempo. Como les dijo mi colega Sep, el panel del día de hoy estará dividido en 4 bloques. En cada bloque haremos una pregunta a panelistas de diferentes países para que podamos escuchar diversas perspectivas sobre el mismo tema. Cada panelista tendrá 3 minutos para responder. Todas estas respuestas se harán en vivo, a excepción de nuestros colegas en Cuba que, bueno, como saben, tienen ahora problemas meteorológicos y no podrán conectarse en vivo. Entonces, ellos han grabado sus respuestas. Entonces, a excepción de nuestros colegas de Cuba, el resto va a estar respondiendo en vivo. Estamos muy conscientes de lo que está ocurriendo ahora con ETA. Esperamos que gente en Cuba y en todo el Caribe estén a salvo. Recordamos a la audiencia que pueden hacer preguntas utilizando la función del chat de Zoom. Ayer tuvimos excelentes preguntas. Por favor, sigan virtiendo sus preguntas en este chat para que las podamos contestar. Tendremos una sección específica para que intentaremos contestar todas las preguntas de la audiencia. Los panelistas tendrán oportunidad de contestarles de igual forma. Entonces, bueno, esta es la dinámica para el día de hoy y vamos a empezar con el primer bloque. La primera pregunta está enfocada para guías de pesca y operadores de turismo de pesca. Y la pregunta es, ¿cuáles son los principales desafíos para los guías y operadores turísticos de pesca en relación con la gestión pesquera? Por ejemplo, la colecta de datos, derechos de pesca, inclusión en el proceso de toma de decisiones. Le voy a pedir a Fabián Pina de Cuba que nos conteste esta pregunta desde la perspectiva de Cuba. Como les mencioné, Fabián no puede conectarse, pero voy a compartir mi pantalla para escuchar la respuesta de Fabián.
principales desafíos para la gestión pesquera, teniendo en cuenta tanto la actividad de pesca comercial como la actividad de pesca recreativa, especialmente la turística, en mi opinión son dos. Uno es la colecta de datos y la otra es el enfoque de manejo pesquero que tiene que tener en cuenta que la actividad pesquera es una sola, o sea, es una actividad que se basa en la captura de especies, ya sea comercial o desde el punto de vista recreativo. Desde el punto de vista de la recopilación de datos, es uno de los desafíos más grandes que tiene la actividad pesquera en cualquier lugar, debido a la complejidad de la colecta de información en un medio natural donde tanto la parte comercial como la parte turística o recreativa tiene que estar en contratiempo para la mejor preservación de la captura o del futuro de las especies capturadas para su liberación. Entonces hay que crear los mecanismos y los métodos que permitan que esta información sea lo más completa posible, útil y que se puedan utilizar para el manejo. Pero de los dos, el desafío fundamental es el hecho de que como la pesca comercial y la pesca turística o recreativa están operadas en Cuba, están operadas por diferentes sectores o por diferentes usuarios, normalmente no confluyen en la misma mesa para lograr un manejo común de la actividad pesquera. Hay que crear los mecanismos que permitan que el turismo y la pesca comercial se sienten en el mismo lugar, compartan la información, utilicen datos que son de beneficio común para poder realizar un manejo efectivo de los recursos pesqueros, porque a la larga tanto el carpo como el sábalo que se captura comercialmente como desde el punto de vista deportivo es la misma especie y por tanto debe ser manejado de una manera común, conjunta.
Muy bien, muchas gracias Fabián por tu respuesta. A continuación le pido a Adiel de Belice que conteste la misma pregunta. Adiel, te cedo la palabra.
The challenges for this, I think it goes beyond fishing guides and businesses. If we just look at these two sectors, we're already talking about several sectors here. So one is the fishery, where if we talk about fishing guides, we're talking about tourism, and businesses, we're talking also about the business sector. So there's a lack of information, and this is a weakness in guidance to adequately inform both conservation and management. Well, secondly, because of the previously mentioned, fisheries and protected areas managed is concentrated in artisanal fisheries, and that is lobster and conch, and in coral reef habitats. Now, third, for there to be a change in all of this, we need to recognize several things. And for instance, coral reef ecosystems and fisheries are largely dependent on mangroves and seagrass. Right? This is very basic. For instance, in a paper that Peter Momby in Turnip Atoll, one of his papers in 2004, right, he showed that reef habitats that were close to mangroves had high biomass of conservation and commercially oriented finfish species. Now, early finfish management in Belize and also in Mexico largely focused on spawning aggregations. Right? This was mostly done by the nature conservants in collaboration with managers. Right? So in other words, this means that we need to recognize that the finfish fisheries includes the artisanal fisheries and also the recreational fisheries, which today they're not being strategically managed and are not part of protected areas management. And lastly, fisheries and protected areas management need not only to rely on the biological or ecological aspect, but also the human dynamics, which also include the economic aspects. And that would include the fishing guides and the businesses. So whenever this occurs, then we will have more of a holistic management of recreational fisheries. So I think that's pretty much my response.
Adil, thank you so much. Thank you so much for your response. And I'll pass it now to Captain Scott Hickman. Scott, would you mind responding to the same answer? I'll pass it to you. Thank you.
Scott, looks like you're muted.
We can see you and your boat, but we cannot hear you, Scott. Hopefully you're okay. It feels like you're in the water. Scott, are you trying to talk? Because
I'll text him real quick.
Okay.
Go on.
And while we wait for Scott to fix his technical problems, can I ask Prescott Smith to answer the question, and we'll get back to Captain Scott in a moment. Prescott, would you mind answering the question? Thank you.
Yes, is this it? What I'm looking at here on the screen?
That is correct.
Yes. One of the things in my research, how I became very active in fly fishing, which was started by my father, was recognizing that here is a region in our country, the Bahamas, that belongs to all of us in the region, because we're a global community. And when I examined the conservation model in the Bahamas, I saw it was very restrictive to locals being empowered as far as the scientists being upfront leading the research in the country, also the career opportunities, which really help the locals to use the environment in a sustainable way. And that's really how I got into continuing what my father started, because I was very confused initially as to why is it that he was buying boats, and when it was time specifically for me to go to college. And I recognized later that he was developing a model that was really about conservation, looking at the protection of the nursery system that so many countries benefited from. And so when I went forward and shared with the government that, look, we can use this type of approach not only to empower the ordinary citizens and the country overall, but in twofold, you end up protecting something that so many countries around the world are dependent on. I know it's a long approach, but it was quite a journey during my time in the Defense Force, where I would see so many persons come from Dominican Republic, from Honduras and other countries, the United States, and they were after these marine resources. And it helped me to realize that we had to take an approach where locals are empowered, but at the same time, you're protecting something that the global community is so dependent on. And it was met with a lot of resistance. It wasn't just unique to the Bahamas. I began to study into our college then why they were not included in the process when researchers came in the Bahamas. And I also, pursued why so many Bahamians were not being encouraged to get into the sciences. And these were not just by accident, because when I tried to bring certain information forward, it was met with much resistance. So I started traveling around the Bahamas for over 20 years in the training of hundreds of fly fishing guides. And it was not to the exclusion of a marine biologist or a botanist. It was about promoting an entire model that use our resources in a sustainable way, recognizing that if we did not develop this model in the Bahamas, that this ecosystem was under great threat, as it is in so many countries like that. And so I saw that, this is something that if we're not successful by Cuba, Belize, the United States, we will all ultimately pay the price for it. And that was the birth of how the Bahamas Sports Fishing and Conservation Association and how the legislation that was eventually passed, those were the driving indicators. And I think it's something that needs to be promoted throughout Cuba, Belize, the Gulf, where if locals are not empowered to use the resources in a sustainable way, ultimately it's not a real conservation model. Yeah.
Prescott, thank you so much for addressing that question. Really appreciate it. And so we're in contact with Captain Hickman, and he is back with us. So Scott, would you mind answering the question? I'll pass it over to you. Thank you.
Can you hear me?
We can hear you clearly.
I'm having to use my phone for some reason. I cannot forward the link that was sent to me to this other MacBook that I've been using. I don't know what's going on with my email, and I'm having some issues with Wi-Fi. So I didn't get a lot of that, but Sep sent me the question: challenges for conservation, I believe was the question or the topic.
Yes, that is correct. Scott, let me read it out loud for you again. Sorry, just I have the English version. Seb, would you mind reading in English for Scott, just to make it easier for the translation portion?
Yeah, absolutely. So Scott, the question is for guides, fishing guides and fishing businesses. What are some of the biggest challenges that you run into in terms of connecting the science or the management to conservation and to your businesses?
Well, 10 years ago, I would say it was sustainable access and being able to, we had a big problem in the Gulf where our recreational fishery was out of control, overfishing their annual catch limits, had shrank our season down for the guides or the charter boats down to about less than a dozen days a year for our key species, which is red snapper. And we actually did, with working with partners like EDF, found a way to fight to get our own sustainable, accountable system to harvest those fish outside of the recreational framework, where we have our own allocation now. And the second would be that key component of being accountable. And we're getting ready to launch our electronic logbook program, which took an additional 10 years to get passed. And that'll start in January. And we'll know exactly to the fish, to the pound, what's being caught on the charter boat side, and on especially with this other allocation of red snapper that we have. It's going to be a really well managed fishery, and took, like I said, 10 years to get there. I say new challenges. It's changed a lot. I was talking with some captains the other day on having a dock meeting with our association. And the weather's gotten so crazy the last few years. It's, about the time that we got this system, which we call Amendment 40, where we got our own allocation, now the electronic logbooks, our weather started getting really lousy. And, we're starting to have these conversations about how climate is affecting our fisheries. We had the windiest summer this year, and really the summer before, and a record storm season, which is still ongoing, that we've ever had. And that's a challenge that is unique now that we've got to learn to deal with. And how conservation works with science, our association's done a lot of work. I know Will Heyman's on this call. We've done multiple projects, cooperative research projects in the last 3 years with the group that he works, LGL, on doing really exact fish counts in the Gulf, even finding ways or finding new ways that fish, the connectivity of these fish that we fish for and how they move around on, let's say, pipelines, and what areas are producing these fish with spawning aggregation work. So there's a lot of exciting stuff to be able to connect the conservation to the science side. And we found that to be cooperative research. And it's really been exciting to get our fishermen working, doing that cooperative research. We just did another fish count in the Gulf that changed the way a lot of people look at the fisheries, called the Great American Red Snapper Count. Myself and some other captains were involved in that research project. When you take folks, historical fishermen that have been around for a long time, that the young captains look up to and trust, and they're working with the science community and providing data to the science and the scientists, it's easier for those stakeholders in that fishery to believe the science when their respected leaders are part of that scientific process. And I would say that is the best way that you connect the science to the conservation with these fishermen. And even that flows down to a lot of the recreational fishermen that say, oh, well, this captain, Will was mentioning Hans Gwenden as his favorite avid captain. And having that guy involved as a young captain in these science projects and getting buy-in from these recreational and young charter boat captains, saying, here's a guy that's a highliner, well-respected fisherman doing these cooperative research projects, and they start to buy into the science and the conservation more. I think that's a key component in moving forward with better science-based fisheries management and not more politically motivated fisheries management. Sorry if I went so long.
Seth, can I share something briefly with everyone that I think is an important thing? Because the results of this is you want to really know what is going on in our region. What I shared earlier with you, I found it interesting that during the 22 years it took for us to get the legislation passed, while it was met with great opposition in the Bahamas because of the economic model that was chosen in our country, as opposed to real protection of the resources. I think it's important for people to know that during COVID and the collapse of our economy, the government put together an economic committee. And what they found was that the best model in terms of rebounding for our tourism was the very industry that we got great resistance. And so I think it's a great opportunity for the Caribbean to know that at this particular environment, COVID environment, the very model that we were pushing in terms of a Krista and a Vanessa, the local guides truly being empowered, the government now has found that because of the cruise ship industry and the big hotel, social distancing, the promotion of fisheries, sports fishing, whether fly fishing, scuba diving, it is the best source of the recovery or chance for the recovery of our economy here in the Bahamas. So I just wanted to share that because it's an opportunity that we can truly seize on in terms of bringing that level of protection that is needed for this resource here that is connected to all of us. Yeah.
Thanks, Prescott. Yeah, and we'll have a COVID-19 specific question here shortly as well. So we can dig into that a little bit more.
This is Captain
Scott, so sorry, but we got to move on.
Okay.
We do have a packed schedule.
Thank you so much, Prescott and Scott. And yes, Seth is right. We'll have a chance for folks to provide more feedback. For now, we ask panelists to keep it short to 3 minutes. What we will do, I will repeat the question, and we will also type them in the chat function, so that way panelists in attendance can keep track of the questions. Thank you so much to Fabián, Adiel, Scott, and Prescott for their questions. Ahora vamos a pasar a la segunda pregunta. Esta pregunta es para administradores. Y la pregunta es, ¿cuáles son las principales barreras para la gestión eficaz de la pesca recreativa en Cuba? ¿Cuáles son los próximos pasos que se podrían tomar para superar estas barreras? Voy a pasarle la palabra a Araceli Hernández de Cuba, y para lo cual voy a de nuevo compartir mi pantalla. Un momento, por favor.
Las principales barreras se presentan en la pesca recreativa, que no se practica por el turismo. Y estos pescadores recreativos que son, bueno, del pueblo, de los asentamientos pesqueros que se encuentran en ciudades cercanas al mar y practican esta pesca recreativa también como un método de alimentación para sus familias, se encuentran muy dispersos. No pertenecen a ninguna organización. Solo aquellos que posean embarcaciones sí pertenecen a una base de pesca. Otra barrera es la escasa atención científica que se le ha brindado a esta actividad pesquera, ya que la mayoría de las investigaciones se han dirigido a pesquerías masivas, a pesquerías de especies vulnerables o en peligro y a especies de interés económico. Existe también una escasa divulgación sobre las buenas prácticas para una pesca recreativa sostenible y sobre la importancia del cumplimiento de las normas y cuidados del medio ambiente. No existe además una interacción de los pescadores con los científicos y tomadores de decisiones. Los próximos pasos que ha tenido la comunidad científica cubana es que, bueno, ya se creó un grupo nacional sobre pesca recreativa y deportiva que está conformado por varias instituciones científicas relacionadas al tema. Y entonces ya en cada institución ha involucrado en sus investigaciones y en sus proyectos de investigación temas relacionados y dirigidos a la pesca recreativa. Entre estos proyectos se pretende realizar una serie de talleres de intercambio con los pescadores recreativos, donde se traten temas sobre las buenas prácticas para una pesca sostenible y amigable con el medio ambiente. Y también se pretende realizar una capacitación, concientización sobre el tema, entre otras investigaciones donde ya se caracteriza a profundidad esta actividad pesquera, se conozca bien qué especies se están capturando, qué especies son de interés, qué especies son secundarias, entre otras investigaciones también estudiar el ambiente donde más ocurren este tipo de pesquerías y saber qué realmente es lo que afecta al medio, cuánto afecta a la pesca recreativa, cuánto afecta a otros factores. Bueno, eso es lo que se pretende por ahora. Ya se tienen incorporado, como he dicho, en los proyectos investigativos de estos centros científicos, lo que es la investigación dirigida a la pesca recreativa, que anteriormente no se estaba realizando.
Muchas gracias por la pregunta, por responder esta pregunta a Yayi Hernández. Voy a volver a hacer la pregunta, también la tenemos en la función del chat, y voy a pedir a Víctor Shaw de Belice. And the question is, what are the main barriers to the effective management for recreational fishing? What next steps could be taken to overcome these barriers? I pass it over to Victor. Victor, please go ahead.
All right, thanks very much. So the way I see it, in Belize, there's three main barriers to effective management, and I wouldn't want to list them because all of them are about even. The first one I'd like to touch base on is the adequate enforcement and compliance mechanism. Development of plans to guide management to regulate the sector, as well as to get stakeholder feedback, would fall short of effective management if we don't have the necessary mechanisms in place to encourage compliance and regulation, compliance with the regulations and enforcement when necessary, especially when we get into the realm of illegal fishing activities and poaching of protected species. Second to that would be the need for more research. In Belize, we have had over the last couple years more research into the recreational fishing sector, the most recent one being led by Dr. Adiel Pires, which identified the connectivity between our fishery stocks in Belize and those in Mexico. However, we don't have a lot of data for a lot of the stocks across the country, and that also impedes management effectiveness, because you would have to know where a resource is and their location before you could effectively manage it. And the third one to that would be greater education, and greater education would come off the back of the increased research to fill the data gaps, and would further be supported by the compliance mechanisms that would need to be in place. Now, to overcome some of these barriers, the steps that we have taken so far and would like to continue to take after the pandemic has, or after we reach a state of normalcy in either addressing the pandemic or learning to live with the pandemic, would be to increase intersectoral collaboration when it comes to compliance and enforcement. And this was an initiative that we had started with two protected area managers in the northern and central areas of Belize, but because of the pandemic, the financial resources for both our organization and for our counterpart became strained. So there wasn't that financial resource available to invest in compliance and enforcement that would require the necessary boats, fuel, and other such technology. When it comes to the increase in research and monitoring, we have had several conversations with different research organizations to agree on areas that both of us shared interest. However, those again would come at a financial cost. We all know monitoring costs and research costs. So that's very limited. And when it comes to education outreach, what we have done is in Belize in the recent, I'd say 2 to 3 years, there have been more communication between guide associations, and the management sector. So I lead the sport fishing management program at the Coastal Zone Management Authority here in Belize, and over the last 2 to 3 years, we have had, I'd say, almost quarterly meetings between myself and the chair or the leader of these different stakeholder community groups to work together to see how we could, without necessarily having to rely too much on stringent management measures, but how we could work together towards getting to understanding of how the resources should be used, and they have their say in how to guide our decisions to a certain extent. Obviously, you'd always want stakeholder buy-in when you make a decision, and there are guys who are always on the front lines. So most likely what they agree on would work versus not work. They'd usually be at the right place. Thanks.
Victor, thank you so much. Thank you so much for answering that question. A continuación, le voy a pedir a Leopoldo Palomo que conteste la misma pregunta. Polo, adelante, por favor.
Hola, ¿qué tal? Buenos días. Bueno, pensando en cuáles son las principales barreras para la gestión eficaz de la pesca recreativa, en México, como en muchos lugares, tenemos información escasa. Creo que es importante resaltar que hay información escasa en... a ver, permítame un segundo. Okay. Información escasa respecto a la historia de vida, los patrones migratorios de las principales especies objetivo. Pensando en la pesca en los humedales, tenemos palometa, sábalo, macabí, que es el bonefish, y róbalo. Y de estas especies, únicamente tenemos una ley de pesca recreativa en México y únicamente el sábalo, el tarpón, aparece como una especie exclusiva para la pesca recreativa. Esto la hace sujeta a que políticas de gobierno puedan enfocarse en programas de conservación o poderlos apoyar más. Sin embargo, para las demás especies no hay mucha información y es poco lo que se hace. Inclusive para el sábalo no hay una zona de veda o periodos de reproducción. La información es escasa respecto a su biología y patrones migratorios, como mencionaba. Nos hace falta registros confiables del número de visitas de los pescadores recreativos. Es más fácil poder ordenar a los pescadores de zonas de humedales, a los de fly fishing, la zona de los flats, que a los pescadores de mar abierto. Y es más fácil también porque el estilo de pesca, de captura y liberación, hace que sea una comunidad que al fin y al cabo puede organizarse con un objetivo común. No tenemos también zonas geográficas de pesca recreativa, sabemos cuáles son las comunidades, las localidades. Desde ahí se hacen viajes que pueden ser de más de 100 kilómetros para zonas de humedales en aguas interiores. Y los problemas que ellos ven son los mismos guías, son que hay muchas redes que están prohibidas y que atrapan todo, de la pesca furtiva. En estas zonas, a mí me gusta llamarles zonas efectivas de pesca. Tratamos de hacer monitoreos para poder saber exactamente cuáles son las zonas que los pescadores recreativos utilizan y con eso poder dar una base para generar políticas de manejo y de conservación, sobre todo en esas zonas. Falta información del impacto socioeconómico y esto puede ser fundamental porque teniendo información de la derrama económica que deja la pesquería en cada localidad, va a hacer voltear el interés de los gestores de políticas de manejo, mover los reflectores hacia esas zonas y poder generar o apuntalar políticas que sean de conservación y que puedan ayudar al desarrollo de la pesquería. Respecto a los pasos que se podrían tomar para superar estas barreras, pues algunas ya las he mencionado. Creo que los pescadores recreativos se pueden organizar en cada comunidad, como observo que lo hacen en Quintana Roo, en Yucatán, en Campeche. Tienen este objetivo común de conservación. La captura y liberación es algo que cada vez se manifiesta más, inclusive en los torneos de pesca. También eso es importante, cuando hay torneos de pesca, no siempre se invita a las autoridades de institutos de gobierno o ONGs que puedan dar fe, legalidad y sobre todo tomar datos de las capturas. Hace falta como que esos vínculos todavía en la mayor parte de los torneos. Capacitar a los guías es otro punto importante. Yo considero que la riqueza de un lugar elegido como sitio de pesca por pescadores extranjeros, la riqueza está en su gente, está en la experiencia del guía, en el trato que da, en cómo se desarrolla la pesquería en esa zona. Platicaba con un pescador recreativo de Florida, me parece, que había visitado dos lugares, Punta Allen, que está al sur de Quintana Roo, y Holbox, que está al norte. Y en ambos le gusta pescar, pero él me decía, prefiero venir a Holbox porque el trato es más relajado, es más de amigos, aquí me divierto. Y cuando voy a Punta Allen, ahí voy cuando yo siento que necesito mejorar mi técnica, hacer un gran slam, y tengo guías que me ayudan en ello. Entonces la riqueza de los lugares está en su gente, en sus guías. Creo que también deben de generarse códigos de buenas prácticas de manejo. Esto es reunir a gobierno. Esto es más fácil de hacer en áreas naturales protegidas, donde se puede tener participación del gobierno con los sectores de usuarios del sistema, como pescadores comerciales, guías de turismo, pescadores recreativos o los guías locales, y entonces generar un código de buenas prácticas. En esta zona pescamos de forma recreativa, cuáles pescan ustedes de forma comercial, el turismo o los viajes en bote, dónde los realizan, y entonces tener un acuerdo en la velocidad en la que van a manejar los barcos, la distancia, el respeto que debe haber entre embarcaciones que están usando una misma zona. Es fundamental poder tomar un registro periódico de los visitantes, del número de visitantes. Si bien tenemos leyes muy buenas en México para lo que es la venta de los permisos de pesca recreativa, se le pide a los lodges de pesca, a los operadores turísticos que lleven un registro de dónde viene su gente, qué días vienen a pescar, cuánto pescaron. Esos registros no se llenan, muchas veces son registros vacíos porque al no haber una función, no tiene capacidad muchas veces el gobierno de poder revisar y estar recolectando y solicitando esa información, pues simplemente no se lleva. También eso, facilitar la venta de permisos, si bien se hace de internet y se puede hacer todo el año, una vez que el permiso es vendido, no sabemos dónde fue ejercido. Tenemos a veces que tenemos el municipio donde se vendió, pero muchas veces no está la información de a dónde fue a pescar el pescador, el visitante, cuántos días hizo. Entonces deberíamos de poder facilitar esa venta de permisos directamente en las localidades, por los municipios. Y considero finalmente que es importante crear comités de pesca recreativa en las localidades. Esto va a abonar a la gobernanza de cada localidad, tener una unión entre representantes de cooperativas, pesqueras, turísticas, gente local que forme este comité de pesca recreativa y que pueda hacer gestiones con municipio, con estado, con gobierno.
Leopoldo, te agradezco muchísimo tu pregunta. And we're going to go next with Vanessa. Vanessa, just as a reminder, the question is, what are the main barriers to the effective management of recreational fishing? What next steps could be taken to overcome these barriers? And we are asking panelists to stick to 3 minutes. Please go ahead, Vanessa.
Good morning, panelists. Good morning, attendees. I think the research, in looking at the Bahamas over the past 10 years, our research specifically on the bonefish fishery, our knowledge has broadened. Our understanding of bonefish behaviors and habitat use has been increased. Bonefish populations rely on coastal habitats for all stages of its life history. As adults, showing strong site fidelity in these shallow flats, migration through corridors such as creeks and canals to spawning aggregation sites on reefs. For juvenile habitats, we've seen shallow open bottoms and bays adjacent to these deeper water areas. It's important for all habitats to be protected, and that means balancing, and it's a delicate balance between development and minimizing alterations to these habitats. I think that's one of the main barriers seen here in the Bahamas. Post-COVID and the need to diversify our economy, the need for development has increased. And I think going forward, we need to pay close attention. So in terms of next steps to overcoming these barriers, firstly, we need to shift our perspective. When I say shift our perspective, I don't think that's for anyone on this call, because I think we share a common goal and we have an understanding just how valuable the fishery is. But let's look at what I call the big 3 fisheries in the Bahamas, and that's spiny lobster, Nassau grouper, and the queen conch. Those industries value $1.4 billion US annually. When we look at the recreational fishery and we look at some of the values placed both by NACOC 2016 and Tony Fedler, Dr. Tony Fedler, and his valuation, we're looking at a multi-million-dollar industry, hundreds of millions of dollars. And I think for policymakers, we really need, for the average Bahamian, I think we need to realize the value of the recreational fishery, and it's just as competitive when we compare the commercial fisheries. Secondly, a realization that these natural habitats, these natural systems that are usually first sacrificed for development support livelihoods, in these smaller island communities, and they should be protected as such. Finally, it has to be a collaborative approach among managers, scientists, and guides, continuing research to inform management decisions, also restoring important habitats, and resource users continuing to speak up and out on activities and decisions that ultimately put the industry at risk. Thank you.
Vanessa, thank you so much for addressing that question as well from the Bahamas perspective. I'm going to ask now Dr. Warren Potts to answer this question. So please, Dr. Potts, please go ahead.
Sorry, so those are the questions that were sent to me yesterday, is that right?
That is correct. And and the question, just to make sure, is the same as what are the main barriers to the effective management of recreational fishing? What next steps could be taken to overcome these barriers?
Sorry, just give me a couple of minutes and then revert to me now. I didn't seem to get that question earlier, so I'll just give me a couple of minutes. That's okay?
Absolutely, absolutely, and sorry about that. So that was actually we can translate now to Seb, who has another question, and we can go back to Dr. Potts in a moment. So Seb, do you want to take it from here?
Yeah, thanks, Lalo. Okay, the next question, question 3, is more directed for scientists and NGOs. And what is the role of science in creating effective recreational fisheries management? I think we've heard several answers on this from different folks, but what opportunities are there to improve that linkage between science and management? So we'll start with Laura Lopez, and then we'll have Adiel, then Fernando, and then Krista. Lalo, you want to start Laura's response?
Yes, thanks, Nick. Let me share Laura's response. Give me 1 second.
El papel de la ciencia es realizar investigaciones pertinentes cuyos resultados puedan ser aplicados y replicables. El desarrollo de investigaciones enfocadas en la pesca recreativa en Cuba constituyen una importante contribución a la ciencia, pero sobre todo debe contribuir al manejo y protección de las especies, al desarrollo sostenible de esta modalidad, la cual se prevé una intensificación, así como intentar que las recomendaciones que se hagan contribuyan al desarrollo local de las comunidades costeras. Es por esto que la ciencia debe en todo momento acompañar a los tomadores de decisiones brindándole las herramientas para cada caso. La nueva ley de pesca aprobada el pasado 2019 constituye una oportunidad sin precedentes para mejorar el vínculo entre ciencia y gestión, una vez que reconoce la importancia de los resultados científicos y crea los mecanismos de diálogo y consultas mediante la Comisión Consultiva de Pesca. Las alianzas entre instituciones científicas, por ejemplo las universidades, con los gobiernos locales, entidades estatales, la industria turística, áreas protegidas, son indispensables. Si bien hay buenos resultados en ejemplos concretos desarrollados en el Parque Nacional Jardines de las Reinas y el Parque Nacional Ciénaga de Zapata, estos aún no son suficientes. Además, en Cuba contamos con las creaciones de redes donde intervienen universidades, centros de investigación y comunidades. Tal es el caso de la Red de Desarrollo Local de la Universidad de La Habana, que constituye una fortaleza para mejorar la gestión y gobernanza de la pesca recreativa. A partir del 2015, el Centro de Investigaciones Marinas comenzó a gestar un proyecto relacionado con la pesca recreativa, dirigiendo su estudio no solo a los aspectos biológicos de las especies objetivos de esta modalidad, sino incorporando análisis socioeconómicos de la actividad, enfocándose en los pescadores recreativos de las comunidades costeras, donde la capacitación de pescadores y otros actores relacionados es fundamental, teniendo como fin último promover alternativas económicas sustentables para los pescadores y su comunidad. En este marco se incorpora otro proyecto de conjunto con otras instituciones nacionales como el Museo Antropológico Montané y el Parque Nacional Caguanes y el Instituto Harte de la Universidad de Texas. Dicho proyecto, Antropología Rural y Pesquera, Estilos de Vida y Adaptación al Cambio Ambiental de Poblaciones Agrícolas y Pescadores Residentes en Yaguajay, han tenido muy buenos resultados, alentadores, propiciando alianzas para continuar trabajos en el futuro. Los proyectos que analizan esta temática desde una perspectiva multidisciplinaria e interinstitucional, en concordancia con una visión de desarrollo como proceso multinivel que conecta diferentes regiones del país y es capaz de conectar con experiencias internacionales a fin de lograr un aprendizaje de las lecciones aprendidas y que se ajusten a las características de cada región, son muy necesarios. Esta nueva mirada hacia la pesca recreativa en Cuba está transitando por un proceso de estudio que apuesta por las mejores prácticas para su desarrollo. Esperamos buenos resultados próximamente. Gracias.
Nice job to the translator. That was really quick. All right, next we will go to Adiel. What is the role of science in creating effective recreational fisheries management, and what opportunities are there to improve that linkage? Adiel, over to you.
All right, sure, thank you. Well, science is very important. And like I have mentioned earlier, there's a need to consider both the natural and social sciences in understanding recreational fisheries. And by doing this, we would first be able to evaluate in a holistical manner the recreational fisheries. And the good thing is about these approaches is that it allows for the identification and then address the threats and needs, which means that science would usually answer some of the questions like which species, when are those species captured, where, referring to the habitats, who, referring to people, how, referring to the fishing methods, why, also referring to people, and what is being used to regulate or manage. Of course, this is referring to conservation tools and management strategies. Then finally, conservation management would be the actions guided by science. And to answer with the question with the linkages between science and management, fisheries management needs information from science for it to be effective. However, we need science with applicability to human welfare and activities. This does not only mean referring to anglers, guides, businesses, but also other activities that utilize the same areas or habitats where recreational fishing is occurring. Now, those activities, for instance, include like artisanal fisheries, recreational tourism, tourism development, mining, rural and urban development, and agricultural activities. So this means that there's a need for a regional and a national scientific community, right, where researchers, institutes, universities, NGOs, recreational fishing communities, referring to the stakeholders and managers, to be able to sit together and devise a holistic strategy for addressing conservation and management needs. Of course, not forgetting that there are also finfish fisheries, right, artisanal fisheries, right, which also target some of the same species that are being captured by recreational fisheries. So in other words, science is going to provide that information that's going to guide conservation and management. I think this sums everything regarding these two questions.
Yeah, Adiel, and we've seen that last point you made pop up several times in the chat as well, the importance of bringing folks from the commercial and the recreational, both the artisanal and the recreational side together. So I think that absolutely is a theme that we've seen recur. Katie Thompson, I believe you're going to take this one instead of Fernando. Over to you.
Great. Thanks, Sep, and thanks for having us on this panel. I wholeheartedly agree with the panelists that came before me and their answer, and that science is very important and something that has to happen. There, of course, also has to be the correct legal and policy structures in place to receive that science, so that science informs the management and the laws, and that those management plans and laws are adaptive to as our climate changes, as the fisheries change, we need to change with them and how we manage them. And then second, a key part of this conversation, and one we've learned with the case studies we've conducted globally on rec fishing policies and programs, is funding. So science has to happen, but how will it be funded? Where is the money going to come from? And we've learned of a few different mechanisms that are taking place that have been successful. For example, tournament fees, a portion of those fees going directly towards an institution or a group of stakeholders who are in charge of defining what science needs to happen and actually carrying out that science and that research. So funding is a really key part of this conversation that can't be ignored, particularly as we recover from COVID. A lot of economies are in shambles. So where is that money going to come from? Rec fishing is an industry with a lot of opportunities. Anglers pay a lot of money to travel far and wide to fish. So how can we capture that potential profit and fund the right kind of science that needs to happen so that rec fishing is a sustainable activity for the region? Thanks, Sep.
Thanks, Katie. Yeah, and I think a lot of folks can agree with both of those points. And we've seen several of those brought up in Warren Potts's global review as well. So great points. Finally, and then last but not least, we'll turn it over to Krista, who touched on this a little yesterday.
Yes, thank you, Seth. Yeah, I also agree with a lot of the sentiments expressed by the panel this morning. So we know science is integral if we want to have effective fisheries management, to make sure that we're protecting critical habitats, we're reducing impacts to species. For recreational species in the Bahamas, a lot of them are catch and release. So making sure that information, and it has been, for example, with the bonefish fishery, used to recommend best handling practices. All that's important. And as Adiel and Katie also mentioned, making sure it's interdisciplinary. So we're also capturing the socioeconomics as well, and using that information to understand stakeholder perspectives, where there are synergies, where we have commonalities. Sometimes we're speaking the same language, but not understanding each other, and using that really to drive things forward, and to increase compliance, to use that to our advantage to make sure that the education outreach materials are a little bit more effective, especially in places like the Bahamas, where we're so fragmented and spread out, to make sure that people are accountable in doing their part and understand the value of that, even if they're not directly involved in the fisheries sector. So in terms of improving links for science and management in the Bahamas, I feel like we still have a lot of room for improvement, to make sure that we have proper systems and structures in place, so that things don't take so long, but that also we are able to adapt as new information becomes available, as unexpected things happen like this year with COVID, to make sure that we're still having productive fisheries, and they're providing the socioeconomic benefits to everyone that relies on them. So thanks.
Thank you, Krista. Now we'll transition to question 4, and I know this probably feels a lot like drinking from a fire hose. So after question 4, we will take a quick 10-minute break for people to stretch, kind of shake it off a little bit, and then we'll come back after that short break for some Q&A that we've been pulling together from the great questions in the chat. But before that break, let's tackle question 4. And this is, we have a few folks from across the spectrum that will ask this, but fishing guides spend a significant amount of their time on the water observing changes in the fishery, and educating their clients and communities about their fishery. How can managers, scientists, and NGOs learn more from guides and partner towards common conservation and livelihood goals? We heard a lot about this already, but if there's anything to add, we'll first start with Tamara, and then Nick, then Katie, Vanessa, and then Dr. Warren Potts. Lalo, you want to cue Tamara?
Yes, absolutely. Except, let me share my screen again.
Ante la pregunta de cómo pueden los administradores, científicos, ONG o otros actores en general aprender más de los guías de pesca que están siempre en el agua y que tienen mucha información para lograr objetivos comunes de conservación y de economía locales, considero que hay dos aspectos fundamentales. En primer lugar, se debe implementar un sistema de información que recopile datos de pesca y recreativas y que a su vez los disemine para que sean puestos realmente en acción, y crear espacios donde confluyan los guías de pesca con estos actores mencionados anteriormente, administradores pesqueros, investigadores, científicos, ONG, que permitan escuchar los criterios, las vivencias de dichos guías de pesca para implementarlo, para incorporarlo en la gestión pesquera. Esto pudiera derivar en una mejor conservación de los recursos de las especies focales para la actividad de pesca recreativa y por tanto pudiera generar mayores beneficios en el corto y mediano plazo y mejor y más bienestar humano para estas comunidades locales que dependen de estas actividades o que pueden desarrollar en el futuro estas actividades a mayores escalas y tener mejores formas de vida similar a los valores culturales que tienen nuestras comunidades pesqueras.
Thank you, Tamara. Now we'll turn it over to Nick Requena. Are you still there, Nick? I know Nick was having some issues with the storm and Wi-Fi. I think Nick had to drop off, so we'll turn to Katie Thompson.
Actually, my colleague Fernando is going to take this one.
Sounds good.
We're keeping you on your toes, Sep. Okay, good. Right, so Katie was mentioning in her presentation and just now, and our Cuban colleagues as well, a project we have been involved in for 2 years now with the Heart Research Institute, the University of Havana, and CIP, Centro de Investigaciones Pesqueras, which is Yeyi's organization, which is to kind of think about how recreational fisheries are managed in Cuba. And when we started this, the new fisheries law kind of came about. So it's been a really good opportunity to bring everything together. So one of the first things we did, we had a summit in last July in Havana, and we really thought hard about who would need to be involved in the decision-making and the science to inform it's not a new recreational fishery in Cuba. I mean, it's been going on forever, but this idea that it's really internationalizing a lot, thanks to groups like Jardines de la Reina and Zapata that are bringing in international clients. The Cuban government made it very clear that the recreational fisheries are an important resource, untapped resource for these coastal communities. So we were very clear to bring in the guides first. Katie did some workshops with them to get an idea of where they're fishing, how are they training. We found out that a lot of the rec fishing operations were still foreign run, but that there was a Cuban kind of grassroots drive to train within Cuba and a lot of love for and really good guides. And so we invited them to this workshop in July, a group, it was about 7 or 8 recreational fishers. So we had them there at the table. And I think that was critical because they were able to be very frank and be on the same level playing field as us, and make clear what their priorities were for economic development of the community, how fishing could be monitored with science, how licenses could be made to the community. And so out of that meeting, we created what we call the Grupo Nacional, which is a Cuban, translates as a Cuban national group that is really a scientific body, but it includes the fishing guides as part of gathering information. So from the start, we created this body, which brings in the guides, the scientists, mostly from the University of Havana and SIP, that are now informing the science and the policy. COVID's kind of gotten in the way of how we manage and organize that group, unfortunately, because we haven't been able to get to Cuba since last July. Well, we got down in December, but we really feel good about this effort that was started at the beginning with rec fishing guides, with scientists and authorities, so that we're all informing each other and we're all going at the same speed. The other thing we did as part of this project was last September, we brought a group, a delegation from Cuba to Seychelles, which is 9,000 miles away. And you'd be surprised at how similar the threats and the challenges are. We found out by talking to fishing guides in Seychelles that the fishery is managed very differently. It's done more out of protected areas and nonprofits that issue the licenses in Seychelles. But we really were able to learn a lot and have that exchange. And I know that's crazy, an exchange from so far away, but it was really valuable. And we weren't able to bring the Seychelles group to Havana, again, because of COVID, but that is in our plans. So that's been our approach so far for this project in Cuba. It was a great meeting we had last July. Prescott Smith was there as well, bringing some of the perspective from fishing guides in Bahamas. So that's worked out pretty well for us, and we look forward to moving that along and keeping everyone posted on how this project moves along.
Thanks, Fernando. Yeah, I think everybody on the call and on the panel here recognizes the importance of that human-to-human interaction. It's logistically difficult, but perhaps one of the most effective tools that we all have to connect to each other. And remember that we may be in different places, different communities, but we still have that human element. Lastly, for this question 4, I'll turn it over to Professor Warren Potts. And Professor, I know you were a guide in Angola for a while as well. So just to repeat one last time, how can managers, scientists, and NGOs learn more from guides and partner towards common conservation and livelihood goals?
Yeah, so I have a little bit of experience with this, and let me just start by giving just a quick bit of experience that I have from the university perspective. After I guided, I set up relationships with lodges, which allowed my students to actually be based at fishing lodges as guides, and then they collected their scientific information while they were guiding. And when I compared their theses at the end of the day with those of other students that hadn't had the opportunity to sort of live on site and be intimately involved in the fishery itself, you can see the enormous depth in their knowledge and how much more information they really had about the fish and the fishery that wasn't necessarily apparent with other students. So it's very clear that just from that guides have an enormous role to play. Another component that certainly speaks to this topic is having spoken to guides a lot in the past. They're really the first port of call for a lot of the research hypotheses that come out for us. So we will speak to guides, particularly in areas where there's very little information. And I worked a lot in Angola where there's basically nothing. And the guides gave us a lot of potential information of what might be happening. So if you think of it, maybe some of the fish movement work that we did subsequently, a lot of the hypotheses about where they moved and how they moved were basically tested and were formulated based on information that guides gave us. And the same thing with reproduction work that we had done. Guides gave us information on potential spawning grounds for some of the species. And we managed to identify these spawning grounds, and they've subsequently become protected. You know, so and these are the kinds of real benefits that guides can have for scientific endeavors. Trying to think if there was anything else. The other thing, from a practical perspective, as scientists, we always want to give advice that is practical and can be used by anglers. And if I'm going to make recommendations to anglers in a pamphlet or some kind of formal structure, I will generally first talk to fishing guides who understand the context better. So for catch and release practices, I'll say to the guys, well, what if I recommended X? And they say, well, that's actually quite difficult in this fishery because of the following. And by working together with them, you can come to sort of far more practical solutions to things like, you know, catch and release practices and that type of thing. So yeah, that's pretty much what I have for you right now.
Thank you, Professor Potts. And an oversight on my part, I want to turn it over to Vanessa to be able to answer question 4 as well. Sorry, Vanessa, I'm going through my papers far too quickly.
No, it's fine. It's totally fine. I agree with Professor Potts on the importance that guides play in guiding science and guiding the research. I have been fortunate enough to work in all aspects of the conservation spectrum in the Bahamas. I mean, I was once that graduate research student who had a master's project to do and to design. And I decided I can do it on any aspect of the Bahamian environment, but I chose to do it on bonefish. And the guides played a critical role in this, particularly Sean Leedon from Andros. And I remember designing my acoustic array, and I was like, how am I going to collect all of this data? And you're reading the science, but then you're talking to the guides and you're getting a better appreciation and understanding for what they are observing in the field. And for a guide to tell me, you know, yes, you should put your receiver in this location, because I'm telling you, the bonefish, they start to move in October. When you see that first cold front come through, they start to make these long distance migration in these large schools of hundreds of bonefish. And then they're just by these deep water locations, and they're just waiting. Now, we're not quite sure. I think they're going to spawn. This type of movement has to be linked to spawning. And I'm still kind of amazed that I was able to pull it off in such a short time, and exactly where the guide led me to put the receivers, and we pretty much confirm what they have been seeing for a very long time. So I think listening to the guides, they play a critical role in all of this. And I think it's very important, to incorporate them in every aspect. How can we work together? I'll put on my different hats, because I've worn a hat, each one of these hat at some point in my career as a scientist, understanding what is happening in the fishery, what is the status, connectivity, and answering some of these bigger questions like climate change and how it will impact the fishery. I think we have to understand it from a social perspective as well. I think that is hit home in all of the responses today. We cannot isolate the social science, because it's equally important, especially in sustaining livelihood. As a manager, with my manager hat on, it's taking the science and advocating for protection of the resource, and whether it's through protected area or looking at some of the critical threats like development that really impacts these habitats, and minimizing these risks as best as we can. And from the guide's perspective, I think we have to include them in all aspects of this process to protect livelihoods, to have them sitting at the table with managers and with researchers. I think ultimately we all have the best interest of the fishery at heart. We just see it from different lens. But I think ultimately it boils down to protecting livelihoods.
Yeah, Vanessa, and I think that's a great note to end on before our break. We've heard continually from folks, not just the importance of the biological science and the ecology, but also the social science piece. And I think one of the key ways to elevate guiding voices and guiding livelihoods is through demonstrating that economic impact. You know, a lot of us, when we say we work on recreational fisheries, people say, you mean, you know, the people that go out and catch 1 or 2 or 3 fish? What's the big deal there? But it may be small scale, but it's not small harvest or small economic impact. So let's take a 10-minute break. Let's all come back at 11:30 Eastern. And then we'll have an hour of some questions curated from yesterday, as well as a few questions curated today, but there are far too many to go through all of these, but great questions from everybody. And let's take a quick 10-minute break. Thanks all. right, welcome back, everybody. Hopefully everybody got a little chance to stretch, grab a coffee, or even maybe on the East Coast and places in the East time zone, maybe a little snack as well. Now we're going to have a series of questions that we pulled from yesterday's chat. We'll have a few of those, and then we will have a few questions that we pulled from the panel as well. So let me have a quick check to make sure our panelists have joined back in. If you're on the panel, please turn your video on so that we know you're there. Give me a thumbs up. I see Abiel, I see Krista, I see Fernando, Vanessa, Scott, Professor Potts. I see Katie. Victor, are you still with us? And Leopoldo? I see Victor. Sí. Wonderful. Ms. Polo?
Sí.
All right. And Prescott, you still with us?
I am here and I can hear you loud and clear. I'm right here.
Great. All right, thanks everybody. Well, this one's going to be a little bit more free form. We still ask everybody to try and keep your responses to 2 to 3 minutes. And of course, we've heard a lot of great responses today. So we appreciate if we ask a question that's already you feel like has already been responded to today, then please leave room for other folks to chime in. But we've got room for 3 panelists for each of these questions. And so just use your raise hand function and I'll call on you in order. And so the first question from yesterday is from Eric Wade. And by the way, we tried to pull these questions that related to the broad region and not so much just on individual specific issues. So this first one is from Eric Wade, and he says, it seems that many of the issues affecting recreational fisheries are from sources outside of fisheries. This can include development, pollution, tourism, etc. What are your thoughts on how we can move to a more holistic approach to securing sustainable recreational fisheries management? Panelists, whoever raises their hand first. Like I said, we've got room for a few people. This is going to be kind of like Jeopardy.
I honestly don't see the raise hand issue option, but I could take a crack at it from the Belizean perspective. So yes, there are a lot of outside influence on the recreational sector. However, the recreational sector has a very sort of love-hate relationship with development, in that anytime you find a really good fishing location, there will be influx in development around that location as more not only local owned business, but foreign owned business would want to have access to this pristine location. This is something that happened in San Pedro for Belize. It's pretty much a tourism center at this point, but once had some of the best fishing locations around it. And part of that development was driven by the want of people to gain access to that fishing location. And much like the broader area of fisheries, it is not only recreational fishery that has to deal with these outside influences. The very nature of human congregating in an area and developing means that there's going to be a mixed effect of every activity will be influenced by another activity to a certain extent. And this is why I believe that the human element was highlighted so much by previous panelists, is that the goal of management shouldn't be to necessarily stop development, but more to guide development in such a way that it allows for balance between the activities and the resources that we depend on as humans, as well as to allow for development so that we could gain access to these resources somewhat. And it's a bit of a far analogy, but somewhat like how you would have the sustainable development and logging around certain rainforests. You'd also want to have sustainable access to these fishing locations, while at the same time balancing it with economic and social development. The issue that really arises for recreational fishing is for the great majority of its history, it was not given the same amount of prestige or relevance as some of the more established economic fisheries, such as the conch industry, the lobster industry, and whatnot. So at this juncture in time, because development in most areas and most recreational fisheries outside of pelagics are the flat fishes, which share a habitat with what you would consider pristine beachside development locations as well. So by the very nature of one, it was not given that prestige in the past meant that development wasn't taking it as serious as it development planning, I should say, wasn't taking it as serious as it's been taken now. And there's that clash between the habitat that the flat fishery depend on, as well as the ambience that humans seek when they develop along the coast, which is that nice sandy beach, that calm waters, that whole scenic view. So to get more to the point as to how we could balance the two, I believe Belize took a crack at that through the Integrated Coastal Zone Management Plan, in which we mapped all the activities that occurred along the coast or could occur, from dredging, development, scuba diving, every activity. And we then zoned where each activity would be in contention with each other, and then provide recommendations as which activities should take priority. And this was based on the habitat available within the area, the type of development that was within the area, and also the land open, or the land that could sustain development. We're still, and that, like much of the management sector in recreational fishery, is still a work in progress. But I believe that that would serve as a good frame through which you could address this issue. And the Integrated Coastal Zone Management Plan is a public document available on the website. You could just search it on Google, and you'd probably get it's a lengthy document, I should warn, but it will give you a better idea of where I'm coming from, because it's very hard to summarize. I believe it has like six volumes to one document. It's very hard to summarize all of that in 3 minutes. Thanks.
Thank you, Victor. Yeah, and I was unfamiliar with that, but I've been digging into it a lot this week. It seems like a very applicable model to help balance a lot of those competing interests. I'm going to go to Prescott here in just 1 second, but want to ask Fadila if I can't actually find the raise hand function on mine, and I think it's because I'm one of the hosts. But if you can, Fadila, if you can let people know how to raise their hand, then we'll go to Prescott.
And Seth, I can see actually Prescott has his hand raised.
Yeah, we'll go to him next. I just want Fadila or maybe Diana to let everybody know how you can raise your hand. Or Prescott, you figured it out. Can you tell us how you raised your hand?
Yes, when I hit on where the chat is, I notice all of the names came up to the right, and to the bottom it has mute me, invite, and then lower hand or raise hand. Those options there. But I can see all of the names of all who's on the...
Yeah, under the participants
yeah,
banner
so
on the right.
When you click on chat, you will see there's invite, mute all, and then there's for me as a panelist, there's more, and you can raise hand. So it's under more. Oh, and I think my status. So you have to click on chat.
Yes. Yes, you'll see raise hand, lower hand, mute me, or invite.
Is everyone okay with that?
Thank you, Fadila. Prescott, over to you.
Yes, I can share with you from the Bahamas perspective, and also what I've seen in Cuba, Belize, and in several other Caribbean countries where we went to train guides in the British Virgin Islands. Like I said, the development model chosen for the Caribbean, and just like any young region, it was always taken into consideration persons who control the economics in these countries. And so the development model or the model chosen for the economies was always centered around that. And so what I saw when I went to the government, recognizing that if we are going to protect the resources that not only belongs to us, that so many countries depend on, it cannot be a tourism model that says Bahamians are just there to make it work in the industry but never be owners. And so the whole driving force behind an ecotourism model was based around true protection of the resources. I also examined it from the conservation model. I found that persons who control conservation in the Bahamas will also control the economy of the Bahamas. And while we talked about a lot of things about the ecology and the environment and all the buzzwords, I saw that when major development projects were set to happen in different places, that as long as those persons who control the environment conservation arena were involved in those development, there was silence in those areas. And I think this is not, like I say, it's not unique to the Bahamas. And that's how I became very active in it. So the building of fly fishing guides, even local commercial fishing operations, the sustainable approach, other areas of ecotourism, persons like Vanessa and Krista to be at the forefront when it comes to research. All of these things help to develop a true conservation model that would lead to the real protection of the resources. It does not mean that locals' attitudes are not, always in the best interest, because continued education and the approach my father took to it, where he met persons netting the bone instead of the police arresting, he got persons into fly fishing. And the same thing I did when I came here in Andros. There were 5 persons netting, and today that they are all professional guides, and we don't have any more netting in the area at all. So that's a definite model that I've seen needs to work. But what I found shocking, I'm going to end with this, was that it was met with great resistance by those who say that they were controlling conservation, also controlling the economy of the Bahamas. And I think COVID has provided an opportunity of a lifetime for us, because that model has collapsed, and it's a great opportunity to advance ecotourism that uses the resources in a sustainable way. Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks, Prescott. And I think some great points in there. One that we heard yesterday also from Leopoldo, that the more, the more those local benefits translate to local communities, the more likelihood for stewardship. And also, a lot of folks around the world in the tropics are talking about alternative livelihoods as we see disruption from climate change and fisheries. And I think there's a powerful model in talking about recreational fisheries as one piece of that. Again, not a silver bullet, but an important piece of that puzzle. I don't see any more hands raised, but if there's one other person that wants to chime in, otherwise we will move on to the next question.
I have something to add. I don't see the raise hand in my computer, so is it
Go for
okay
it, Victor.
to?
Yeah, go ahead. Oh, sorry, Adia, go ahead.
Yes, I think to answer also Eric's question, how can we deal with this? One of the things that we can always do is work strategically, and I think presently a lot of the fisheries in the country of Belize and also Mexico is that they don't have a fisheries plan. So, and there are other activities in the different countries that also they either have a plan or they don't consider the environment into their plans. For instance, development or even tourism development should always have consideration of the environment, how important the habitats are for them, because tourists go to different countries to enjoy either the view, the reef, diving, snorkeling, and all of that is present because of our habitats. In other words, if we lose all of those habitats, we will lose the services and the benefits that we get from them. So I think including the different activities that occur, like Victor mentioned earlier, in that we need to work more of a holistic approach, in that we don't just consider the recreational fisheries, but also the other activities that occur in the same areas. And the other activities, they also need to do the same with us, in that they need to consider that where they want to plan development, artisanal fisheries or even recreational fisheries also occurs there. So it has to go hand in hand. I think strategically working in that direction is very important.
Great points, Abiel. And we even heard from Professor Potts yesterday talking about, coordination across ministries, not just in terms of commercial fisheries, but also tourism, and in some cases agriculture, so that more of those benefits and education, so that more of those benefits can translate to the local community, the local workforce, and help prevent some of those sources of economic leakage. Okay, well, let's transition to the next question. And this is more of a question for scientists, but I think it's open to all. Kaylin Clements asked, in trying to provide data and advice to managers about strategies for compliance, what methods for data collection or study design would you recommend? Especially considering we rarely have the time, money, or other resources to conduct an in-depth study. And I think this is more focused on the social science piece. And Sonia has posted this in Spanish and English in the chat as well.
And we actually have Laura Lopez from Cuba who wants to address this question. She's not able to join directly, but she recorded her answer. So I'm gonna share my screen to hear Laura's response. So let me do that now. Please let me know if it's working correctly. Can you see my screen?
Yep, we can see your screen.
Thank you. And I'm going to play Laura's response in Spanish.
Es muy importante conectar con los pescadores. El conocimiento local es fundamental. Es impresionante la percepción de los cambios ambientales y las poblaciones de distintas especies, las épocas de desove que ellos tienen. Pero ellos no siempre entienden las preguntas y los cuestionarios tan estructurados que los científicos les elaboramos, por lo que debemos elaborar encuestas y cuestionarios que ellos entiendan para que puedan colaborar con la investigación, porque a veces dicen que no saben y sí tienen la información, lo que no en el lenguaje que nosotros le estamos pidiendo. Debemos educarlos en la importancia de la conservación, en beneficio de todos, y luego es el reto para nosotros los científicos llevar esa información al lenguaje nuestro, a nuestros diseños de investigación, pero lo mismo ocurre para entonces darle las recomendaciones a los gerentes y tomadores de decisiones. Los científicos tenemos que ser capaces de proveer información en un lenguaje que ellos puedan comprender y puedan usar oportunamente. Con las publicaciones de artículos científicos aún no estamos logrando el objetivo final. A veces los tomadores de decisiones, nosotros no hacemos nada con darles un libro lleno de artículos científicos y resultados que en formatos en que ellos no les es posible manejar ni saben cómo aplicar. El gran reto que tenemos nosotros por delante, considero, es que desde el inicio de los diseños de investigaciones debemos tratar de involucrar a todos los actores que que tengan alguna relación en el tema que vamos a tratar, los pescadores, las áreas protegidas, los investigadores, los tomadores de decisiones, el sector turístico, de manera que todos estén comprometidos y comprendan la ganancia para todos.
Although, can you kind of recap that? We didn't have the translation at the same time.
Yes. Well, Laura, she was saying really that when we are conducting surveys, we should really be making sure that we're using the right type of materials. Like, of course, we're using scientific information, but we do a good job at creating communication materials that can transfer the science into things that the people that are being interviewed really understand what we're trying to address, and so we can really get the most out of that information. Sorry, I was trying to. I was connecting with other Cubans, and I couldn't. I didn't take notes. If somebody else captured something else that I did not capture on Laura's intervention, please chime in. And sorry about the translation. That was not. I should have said that before.
Well, thanks for that response from Laura. Other folks, I'd also be curious to hear from Adiel, who has kind of pioneered some interesting tools that don't have to be expensive, right? They can tap into local knowledge and really be a much more collaborative and co-science research approach.
Yes, for sure, Seb. Definitely, I think to answer some of the question, there are several methods or even techniques that can always be used in social sciences. They're very effective. And by that approach, it automatically starts the involvement or the interaction between scientists and a local community member. Not only that, but also including the different components of a fishery, including the fisheries managers, co-managers in that case, or even chairpersons of tour guide association. It automatically starts that breaking that ice. So using things like interviews, participant observation, which means that if there's activities in the communities, it's always good for the scientists to start getting involved in that, to be recognized, to be accepted, to be part of that. Questionnaires can always be designed as well. And of course, all of those can always or need to integrate local knowledge, because the anglers and also guides and especially also artisanal fisheries are very knowledgeable in the resources. And in the country of Belize, a lot of the guides were artisanal fisheries, and these people have a vast amount of knowledge, and they can always also pinpoint some of the solutions to these issues. So I think there are very good methods out there, and I think maybe a suggestion to EDF is that maybe these papers can be summarized somewhere or shared through I don't know, Google Drive or Dropbox, as long as journal requirements are followed. It should be okay. Yeah.
Thanks, Adiel. And that's a question we continue to kind of ask internally too, is EDF has developed a lot of small scale fisheries online hub, as well as tools. But the more we search on the recreational side, the more we see this need across the entire NGO and scientific community to pull these tools more into a single clearinghouse for people to be able to work on. But that's also the point of this this conference, right, in this special session. Will Heyman also pointed out that there's the Fishers Forum here at GCFI, and that's a mix of commercial, artisanal, and recreational fisheries. So that's a tremendous tool, and I think it just needs to be one of those things that we continue to build Scott, do you have something to elaborate on the voice of the fisherman piece?
Oh, I'm sorry, Sepp. I thought you meant. And you said Scott.
Sorry, Captain Scott Hickman he had typed a response in the chat as well.
Yes.
Yeah, I was just going to have Will elaborate on how that works. And, I've worked with Will for years now, and all the research that they do and through GCFI as well, getting that voice heard and also coming to the fishermen in layman's terms and fishermen's talk in the collaboration going back and forth. Will and his folks have done a real good job with that. And if Will would like to elaborate on the voice of the fisherman, that'd be great.
I don't think we have Will promoted to a panelist. He's definitely going to be on the workshop on Friday.
You type it in.
All right, sounds good. Well, let's go ahead. I'll turn it over to Lalo for the next question, because I know we want to keep rolling here. We've only got about 30 minutes left.
Thank you so much, Seth. And actually, just making sure that Laura's idea was captured. I provided like a quick translation, but I have some important points, some takeaways from Laura Lopez's intervention. So really quick, number one, scientists must learn how to better communicate with fishers and fishing guides and use the same language when conducting research together. Number two, scientists must also think about how to then effectively communicate their research and what they learn from fishers and fishing guides with managers and decision makers. Just sharing scientific reports and articles may not be a format and the language that managers and decision makers can use. And finally, the best way to do this and have the same language is to plan research together with all stakeholders at the beginning. I just want to make sure that those ideas were captured. Thanks to my colleague Valerie for capturing those vital aspects. So now we are going to transition to the next question. I'm gonna have these questions in English. So we have a very important question from David Phillip yesterday, a question about COVID-19 in the region. So David says, COVID-19 has placed tremendous strains on local communities, disrupting food supply, commercial fishing, and recreational fishing livelihoods in ways that many of us couldn't even predict. What impacts are you seeing on the water in fishing communities, and are there cases where local or regional solutions could be employed to help with those immediate issues? So we have these questions typed in the chat box as well, in both English and Spanish. So please, if someone wants to address David's question, please raise your hand. I think we have Scott and someone else sees. Scott, do you want to go ahead and take it?
Yeah, I'd be happy to go ahead. Our fleet here during the first part of COVID was shut down by our local government. And, we felt it was safer for families to come down and catch their food on a boat that was cleaned properly, and we could come up with protocols. So COVID protocols, instead of people going to grocery stores by hundreds, and standing in lines getting into grocery stores. So it was more convincing the local government, and our association played a big role in that. And we developed a COVID plan that we developed on when the boats would be cleaned with bleach. Each fisher would get their own rod and reel designated for the trip. We could social distance on the boats, wearing masks on the dock, having masks. And we developed that plan and submitted it to our local city council and government. And they ended up liking our plan, and they opened us up after being shut down for a month. And we had the people willing to go, a lot of families, and people were stuck at home. So they wanted to get out and they wanted to catch their own meal instead of going to these grocery stores. And I think it was the critical part was just developing a really good plan, and where you would give the local government backing, knowing that the people would be safe getting on the boats. And that was the key to our success, because we could have been closed down a lot longer, is having a voice, getting engaged, having a good COVID plan, and getting our businesses back open. And we've been very successful at that and ended up having a busy season.
Thank you so much for sharing those insights, Scott. Anyone else? I cannot see. Is anyone?
I'd be curious. I know David also had a question yesterday about some netting of bonefish in the Bahamas. So I'd be curious if Vanessa or Prescott or Krista, as you see, it's hard to talk about this issue without also dealing with, the need for food and livelihoods in these communities. And we're going to see more and more disruptions in the face of climate change. And so I think this ties into a lot of the other questions we've seen, the importance of balancing recreational fishing access and management with also subsistence and artisanal fisheries, small scale fisheries that depend on some of these fish stocks as key protein sources around the world. So I'd be curious on the Bahamas side, if anyone has a perspective.
Yes. I have my hand is raised.
Yeah, go ahead, Prescott.
Oh yeah. But just from the experience of seeing what works, like I thought my father really started this, and I saw in Bering Point, and Vanessa spoke to this, where even in my own ignorance, before it really sunk in with me, realized that getting persons into fly fishing, catch and release, that the marine life was increasing in terms of the conch population and so forth. It took pressure of those fisheries. But what I found very troubling as I traveled throughout the entire Bahamas, looking at the reasons for people netting in different islands, and then what I was faced with here was the approach to really deal with these issues. Like I said, I got persons into fly fishing, and that's how we got rid of it. People net various reasons. Some of these are just cultural. As you know, just like in the United States, you have local culture in Alaska and then Texas. And so during the grouper season, I found that some islands would use the bonefish for bait. And then, of course, people traditionally grew up eating bonefish. And so some people are netting them to sell. So there are many different reasons. There's not one, but showing them an alternative, it's an easy way to solve it. And I presented a national proposal in terms of addressing this issue based on what I saw actually work. And it was met with resistance by the establishment who say that they control conservation in the Bahamas. I found it was shocking. But yet there was no opposition to, there's 50,000 yachts that fish in our waters, and they deep drop for red snappers and so forth. And yet I gave a proposal to empower locals that would take pressure off the lobster fishing, conch fishing industry. And it was not embraced. And so that's why I'm very adamant when I speak about persons like Vanessa and Krista and them being upfront or leading the way when it comes to conservation in our country, and not just being used as token, during another overall agenda at the end of the day. So, as I said, the hauling of bonefish from Grand Bahama to Long Island to South Andros, these things are not very difficult to solve. It all leads back to empowering the local people in using the resources where they will earn a lot more money by going out on the flats and getting paid $500-$600 as a guide, as opposed to selling a bonefish for $5 and $10. they earn a lot less, and they can keep doing that with catch and release. Yeah. So from experience, what actually works, the opposite. Yeah.
Thank you, Prescott. And I'm glad Leopoldo raised his hand, because some of your points, Prescott, reminded me of his Polo's presentation yesterday, and talking about, it'd be great to have a busy tourism season year round, but in the off season, a lot of these guides also have to figure out, some of them are working 3 or 4 or 5 different jobs. Some are working in commercial fisheries in the off season. So I'll turn it over to you, Polo.
¿Qué tal? Gracias. Así es, muchos de los guías, al menos aquí en México, hemos notado que no es su única actividad, hacen otras actividades, ya sea que sean pescadores comerciales también, porque pertenecen a la cooperativa, porque tienen la lancha. Entonces debemos considerar que, hablando exclusivamente de los guías ante el panorama del COVID, realmente tienen otras fuentes de ingresos que que muchas veces no son suficientes, pero que les ha ayudado a sobrellevar la pandemia. En específico, hicimos algunas encuestas en Quintana Roo, y yo preguntaba, ¿cómo has estado el año pasado ahora? Pues has perdido clientes, ha habido mucho menos gente. ¿Cómo te has mantenido durante todos estos meses, de abril a agosto, septiembre? Y me respondían que algunos tenían ahorros, los demás habían hecho otras cosas, como trabajar con fibra de vidrio, arreglando motores en un taller, vendiendo comida, como guías de turismo, pero pues el turismo también está colapsado. Entonces eran otras pequeñas actividades que les ayudaban. Y recibían algunos clientes, muy pocos, y las medidas ante el COVID son al principio, todos con cubrebocas, gel, pero en una jornada de pesca eso realmente no parece ser posible. Uno tiene que fraternizar con el cliente, y los clientes igual se sienten a gusto tratando de estar en una situación como antes del COVID. No significa que haya habido focos de riesgo, muchas de estas comunidades están aisladas, sus casos son pocos, pero son cosas que se deben de considerar. Entonces aquí simplemente diversificar las actividades económicas va a hacer que las comunidades puedan sobrellevar la pandemia.
Muchas gracias, Polo. And now we have also see Vanessa raising her hand. Please, Vanessa, go ahead.
I think this is a dynamic situation when we look at the impacts of COVID on fishing communities. And it's something that we have to watch closely and be sensitive about, because ultimately it's food security on one hand and a sustainable fishery on the other hand. And I don't have a magic answer for what that is, but this is where I think communication and social science becomes critical in charting the way forward. I like that the SCA, which is Bahamas Sports Fishing Conservation Association, provides that platform to understand concerns from the guides and try to elevate some of those issues. So I think it's something that we definitely need to watch. The Bahamas is opening up. The SCA is also working on COVID-safe protocols to share with the guides if that can, keep them at ease. Safety comes first, as well as protecting the fishery as well. So it's a sensitive issue, and I just think that we should keep monitoring it. And I think that our approach will change as we see in this post-COVID world. It's a dynamic situation.
Thanks, Vanessa. And I also want to point out tomorrow, I believe it's at 11 a.m. Eastern. You'll have to check the program, but GCFI is hosting the Fishers Forum. And one of the pieces they'll talk about there is how COVID-19 has disrupted, but also some of the solutions that commercial and recreational guides have found in these extremely trying times. Thanks everybody for all your great responses there, because I think this is something where we are all incredibly resilient, but still learning to deal with a lot of these issues. Next, we have a question from Rod Fujita, which came yesterday, and this was directed at Professor Potts. So if you can go first, Professor, and then other folks that may have additional thoughts can chime in after. But you mentioned that in a lot of cases, controlling total harvest of recreational fisheries can be difficult due to the dispersed nature. Can you talk a little bit about tools or management strategies that can help control the total harvest within sustainable limits?
Sure. That's a great question, and something that we've been grappling with for a long time. It's not necessarily an easy answer for this. So the open access nature of recreational fisheries is obviously a major concern. And it's a major concern because of the large number of fishes that you often find in recreational fisheries. So populations are essentially depleted by the impact of many, many individuals, rather than, in a commercial fishery where you have fewer individuals operating. So it's sort of death by 1,000 cuts for the resource. So just to give you an example, in South Africa, where I'm from, the recreational sector, the recreational shore-based sector, if every fisherman kept one fish per year of 1 kilogram, the harvest is already greater than our annual catch in the inshore trawl fishery, which gives you an idea of the real effective numbers of participants in recreational fisheries. So there are lots of potential options. So you can restrict licensing. And there are many examples, particularly in the freshwater realm, where licenses are restricted for the number of entrants into a fishery. Other places have like a lottery system that's used. But I don't think I've heard of too many marine examples where you have actually restrictions on licenses. But there might be a point where that has to happen, where you have, for example, competing livelihood fisheries. And we may need to consider actually restricting the number of entrants into recreational fisheries. But there are other parts of the world, for example, in Australia, where they're actually encouraging participation in recreational fisheries. And that's because of the license fees associated with it, the good health of people that get outdoors and things like that. So they really encourage it, and they encourage it because they've got really strong governance systems. And with regards to governance, there isn't really there's no silver bullet that can fix your governance of recreational fisheries and reduce overall mortality if you have huge amounts of anglers. You basically have to have strong policy, and the policy has to ensure that you have sufficient money to actually manage your fishery, to actually implement the policy. And your management has to be cooperative with stakeholders, and not just recreational fishery stakeholders. So we've spoken about all the different types of stakeholders that might be involved in the types of things that happen in a recreational fishery. So need to be inclusive in those initial discussions on cooperation. And then it's a question of defining a very, very clear conceptual objective for your recreational fishery. From there, you define operational objectives, and then more specifically, things like target performance indicators. And then ultimately you get down to the specific rules and regulations that would dictate your fishery. So all of this needs to happen. And in parallel to that, you have to develop a really strong monitoring and enforcement program to keep a good idea of A, what's going on in the stock, and B, what's happening to try and increase the level of compliance in your fishery. And then in addition to that, you need education and awareness programs that will help fishers. So it's really not one thing. But then I thought I'd just say one other thing that I think is absolutely critical to to stop the potential impact of hundreds of thousands of recreational anglers. And that, I think, is an insurance policy. And your insurance policy needs to be something like marine protected areas. I think as a guideline around, if you can protect 20% of your coastal area from recreational angling or from fishing, that will create a really good buffer for the kinds of impacts that recreational fishing can have. And then the other thing that I just wanted to mention, and it speaks quite a bit to the impacts of climate change, is that we're beginning to see more and more that recreational angling is selectively removing certain fish from the population. And those are the ones that are more likely to feed, often more likely to be aggressive. And some of our research recently has shown that the ones that are more likely to feed at a range of temperatures, for example, are the ones that are taken out first, but those are also more likely to be the most resilient to the impacts of climate change. And that really is indicating to me that marine protected areas not only will serve a role to sort of protect your stock, but they're also preserving the important fishes, individual fish, that will pass on their genes to the next generation and provide some kind of buffer to the impacts of climate change. And that's pretty much what I've got for you.
Thanks, Professor Potts. Yeah, a lot of powerful wisdom in there. I know we had Prescott talk a little bit about some of his work on protected area on the west side of Andros. I know Dr. Aaron Adams had a question in the chat at the very beginning that also touched on the importance of MPAs in terms of conservation. I know Scott Scott Hickman works with the Flower Gardens Banks National Marine Sanctuary here in the US. And I imagine everybody on here has some tie to those insurance policies that you talk about. I think we have time for one more response to this question if anybody is interested. Otherwise, I will turn it over to Lalo for one last question for the panel. Adiel?
Adiel, yeah.
Yes. Yeah, sure. I think I see the question was to mortality, to keep fishing mortality at sustainable levels. I think once a strategy is devised, that is automatically going to be one of the a goal for that strategy. Of course, you need to do the science and identify those things. I think a lot of the science, a lot of the activities of conservation has already been done when it comes to flats fishing. So I think Stephen Cook, Andy Dialchuk, Aaron Adams, and so many has done a lot of research regarding the importance of ensuring survival. And I think they've done a very good education outreach regarding handling of fish, limited time to ensure survival. But what is still missing, in other words, there still needs to be more also on the catch and keep or the catch and consume recreational fisheries, because, and of course, that is more of a sensible fishery in that there's more work that needs to be done also in that area, because, and of course, ensuring different aspects are also being considered, for instance, especially economy. Here in Belize, I'll just give one example regarding that, in that a lot of guys that are hired to go there and do either reef fishing or offshore fishing, they keep a lot of the fish with them. And a lot of the other guides are saying, well, you're already charging money for taking so much fish. Why are you bringing so much fish from out there, and then you're selling it to other hotels or restaurants, or keeping too much of that catch? So some of those things need to be considered. There are two different fisheries, and one of them has already been largely addressed. I think that those have been very well, but there's also need to be more focus on the catch and keep recreational fisheries. All right, that's it. Yep.
Thank you so much, Adiel. That was very insightful. Thank you so much. And we are going to go for the next question. We got this question yesterday from Pepe Gerhardt from Cuba. And Pepe's question is, what are some thoughts about the use of fees or other financial mechanisms that can help finance different types of projects around recreational fisheries management and conservation? What are the challenges to implement those mechanisms in a way that actually contribute to sustained conservation and management? We have these questions typed in the chat box as well in English and Spanish. So this is directed to all the panelists. So please let me know if somebody wants to answer this question. I see Prescott. Prescott, please go ahead and share your thoughts.
Yes, what I've found that, again, speaking from the issues that we face in the Bahamas, is a lot of resources needs to go into empowering our scientists like Krista and Vanessa in terms of the research that needs to take place in our country. Also, I found that throughout the Bahamas, we have hundreds of block nursery systems that need to be restored. And so while persons will say, well, we need to focus on, protecting our Nassau group or protecting the lobster, I find that the linkages to what are the underlying issues as to why a mother in Eleuthera or on Andros goes out and pick up 100 baby conchs because they're thinking of feeding their families. So I take a holistic approach to it. There needs to be resources putting into research, into restoration of our nursery system, also supporting getting persons equipped with training, equipment into the type of fishing areas, whether it be subsistence, commercial fishing, that would take pressure of the traditional way that Bahamians fish in the country. So fly fishing is not, the silver bullet to get everyone to be a guide, but I examine all of the issues that we're facing across the board. And I find that there's a lot more talk, unfortunately, rather than action, but more resources need to be placed into the model that brings about the results that really changes the approach to how we deal with our local fisheries. Because I see persons would come in, give a lot of great speeches, but the locals at the end of the day are not really being empowered the way they ought to be. And from my own personal experience and what my father did, we action, and the action saw the results. When I first started training guides, there was about 60 guides in the Bahamas. Now there are over 400 guides. But I had to leave my lodge to travel to 20 plus years throughout the country. And the cost of that, in terms of no one paid me for it, that means I wasn't fish anglers at my lodge, but I did it because there was just tremendous opposition to empowering the locals with a method that really brought about the results. So I know if we put resources into these things, at the end of the day, we will get the results that we need to see happen in our region. Thank you.
Thanks, Briscoe. That was a very powerful message. Thank you so much for sharing. Do we have anyone else from the panelists?
See Vanessa.
Please go ahead, Vanessa.
Yes. So the Bahamas flat fishing regulations makes a provision for this, where fees collected from licenses and permits, 50% goes towards the conservation fund. I think one of the challenges with this, and that organizations like the SCA will have to ensure is that the monies are used in the priority areas to really guide decision making for the management and conservation of the industry. And so a broad representation of this committee, the legislation also talks about a committee coming together. And I think the representation of scientists, of guides, of local businesses, of the average Bahamian who benefits from this resource to have an input on exactly how those funds are used in the conservation and management of the industry. And I think that's critical. So very early stages, I mean, we have the framework and I would like to see it go a step further to really inform the way forward from here. I'm hoping that in the workshop that we will attend, that we will identify some of these priorities areas, and that will flow into really guiding some of the next steps of how the funding will be used.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Vanessa, for sharing. And we have time for one more intervention, and I see Krista's raising her hand. So please, Vanessa, please, Krista, share your thoughts.
Thanks. Yes, I agree with what has been said before. And one of the things that's been emphasized a lot today is we have a lot of issues to address, but to do that, and Katie alluded to this earlier, we need funding to build capacity to address all these issues. And in terms of having fees and other funding financial mechanisms, I think it's a really important idea, and we definitely need to diversify that as much as possible. But once those mechanisms are in place, making sure those systems are transparent and accountable, and that we have identified goals and priorities to be able to track that progress and report on that, so everyone is aware of what's going on and how that funding is being used, and it's being used appropriately. So that's the only thing I have to add.
Room for a quick 2-sentence.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, so when it comes to finance, that's always a tricky topic, especially my experience in Belize over the last 5 years working in the coastal zone. Honestly, if you talk about finance, there isn't one or two ways to incorporate it. What you would need is a holistic view. So you would really have to start with a 5-year management plan, because then that would guide what finance you're looking for, where you want that finance to go, and who will be the key players. That should also be supported by the adequate legislation for not only compliance and enforcement mechanism, but also to encourage and secure stakeholder partnerships. If the idea that you're gonna get financing, say you have a user pay mechanism, but the users have only a committee that is optional or that only provides recommendation, then you'd find quite quickly that that committee feels disenfranchised because they don't necessarily have that ability to stop or to help approve projects. And that will always cause a room of contention, in that they feel as if the priorities might begin to differ from a management perspective, a research perspective, and a stakeholder perspective, especially when you take into consideration the social element. A stakeholder might value the need to protect a key habitat maybe within the southern region of a country, whereas management looking at the entire country feel like it is better invested maybe in the central, because they're looking at the entire country. And researchers might feel that before we could even talk about starting to protect anything, we need maybe 2 years to collect data. So if you don't have a strong structure in place, a strong legislative structure in place, you would buck heads more often than make progress. And that should all feed into a 5-year plan, so that everyone is on the same page as to what we want to accomplish in the 5-year, and that also provides that bit of transparency and accountability, as you would have mechanisms through which you would report to stakeholders. We did not meet goal X, but that's because, well, in this situation, COVID happened, but in other situations that could be because some other more important and unforeseen scenario occurred that necessitated that you redirect finance. And that way the stakeholders understand where management is heading, and also feel that they are part and parcel of the direction the entire industry is heading.
Sep, you were muted.
Sorry about that. Thanks, Victor. Incredibly powerful. And I think to Victor's point and also to Krista's, this touches on a lot of things that we saw in the Potts et al. Paper from 2019. I think recommendation 4 or 5 is that there's a transparent but sustainable fee-based system in there. So yes, to your point, Krista, we'll absolutely get into that on Friday during these individual breakouts. And unfortunately, we are a little bit over time. So I want to thank everybody for joining today. It was another incredibly productive and educational day. A reminder to everybody, we have our workshop on Friday. The first portion of that workshop will be closed to invited participants, but at 11 a.m. Eastern, everyone's invited to join us at the same Zoom location and listen in to hear the report outs from each breakout group. All those details and agenda items are in the updated GCFI program. And I wanted to thank everybody again for joining and have a great day.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks so much for joining.
Very educational.
Thank you, everybody. There's still some good discussion on chat if anybody wants to look at some of the barotrauma device chat that we've been having.
And thank you also to our interpreters today and our wonderful moderators. Thank you for keeping us all connected. And yes, as Seth said, our next session related to recreational fisheries will be on Friday. However, later today, we have the Cinefish Film Festival, which all are welcome to join. And I'm going to put a link to join that in the chat. So feel free to join the Cinefish Film Festival. There are lots of different films related to marine issues in the Gulf of Mexico and Caribbean region. And then tomorrow, we are going to start with a keynote presentation from Dr. Cesar Toro of UNESCO. And he's going to introduce the Decade of Ocean Science for Sustainable Development. And then that will be followed by another keynote speech, this time from Dr. Yvette Diowadi from FAO. And she's going to introduce the International Year of Artisanal Fisheries and Aquaculture. And then that would be followed by our Fishers Forum, where our fishers are going to talk about the impact of COVID-19 on fishers as well as their communities. All information is available on GCFI's website and on our social media. So thank you again to everyone for joining today. I hope you had great discussions and that this will carry on until Friday. And please join us for all our other activities in the Fish Today, as well as our keynotes and Fisher Forum on tomorrow. So thank you again to everyone and have a wonderful day.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Enjoy, guys.